Hello, Andrew.
A two old elders are
Yes,
going to now dive into their favorite subject, which is not the subject that everybody suspects we love the most, but our favorite subject, which is joy.
absolutely.
When we began this great journey that we've completed in radical regeneration, we began by writing a book on joy because we were so fed up with being branded as doom and gloomers.
Yeah,
We were so outraged at the way in which people tried to put what we were saying in the context of pessimism and nihilism and aggressive grief that we decided to just kick away the chairs and write a full on true blue book on joy.
right.
And that was one of the great experiences of my life doing that book with you, because it really was the book that cemented and deepened the joy of our relationship, the joy from which, in fact, all four books that comprise Radical Regeneration was born. And I was just thinking, I think one of the reasons why this book is having the amazing reception that it is because people feel and know throughout the book, even in the passages in which we confront most unflinchingly and without any illusion or mask the horror and the madness and the craziness, there is this stability and expansiveness in the way in which we deal with these subjects that is born from our own living experience of joy. And that helps people develop within themselves the kind of embrace that can hold this madness. So I'd love to just begin, Carolyn, by asking you a question, and then I'll answer it myself, or try to. How did you, in your life, which has been full of difficulty and suffering and drama, my God, discover the necessity and supremacy of joy? How did you come to know joy and how essential cultivating joy is to do the kind of work that you've been called to do?
Well, I was thinking about that after our brief conversation prior to this one right here. I was thinking about, I suppose, the simplest answer and the most profound answer I could give you is really coming to understand who I am in my deepest self and who other people are in their true, authentic self. And what I realized increasingly is that the real essence of who we are is joy.
Yes.
It is absolute, it is consciousness, it is absolutely life. And life in its fullness is joy. And one of the things that was so helpful to me as we were working on return to joy is that I really discovered, and I know many people in our culture do not yet know this, but I discovered the difference, the profound difference between joy and happiness. And
Mm.
once you've discovered that, you can't settle for happiness as the essence of who you are because it's always greedy, grasping, wanting more because it doesn't satisfy us. Joy is what really satisfies us. And sometimes it doesn't look like happiness at all. Sometimes, ironically and strangely enough, it might look like the death of a loved one or the
Mhm.
death of an animal or some huge loss in our life that's very sad, but makes us stop and go deeper and explore. What was that? What is this? This is very profound, and that really opens us up to joy.
Can you give an example from your own life? Can you give an example of that?
Well, I'm thinking of putting down an animal friend, Ethel, back in 2010 after I had just moved to Boulder
I remember.
and having to euthanize her. And her death, I don't know why at that particular time, took me to a deeper level of grief than I have ever gone in my life. And it was like this really profound existential experience for me that took me years to kind of move through. And even now, an interesting story about that is, I listen to Bach a lot like you do. And so at that particular time, I was listening classical music in the house and a lot of Bach. And so when we got to the vet's office to put her down, I laid down on the floor with her, and the doctor was very sweet, and there was no one else around except a friend that I had brought with me. And the doc said, okay, I'm going to give her 2 shots. And in a moment, I'll come in and give her the first one, which will completely relax her. And maybe I'll play some music as I go out and come back. And so she started playing Well-Tempered Clavier. And that just hit me like a knife in my heart. And so as I'm laying there holding Ethel in my arms. And it took me a couple of years before I could listen to that piece again, because it just ripped my heart out every time. Now I listen to it today as one of the most joyful pieces of music in my life that I've ever heard, and marvel at it as a complete miracle. And part of my joy is, how was it that the doctor who didn't know me at all chose that one? That was a profound moment of joy for me. It wasn't a happy moment, but it was deeply joyful and meaningful.
What a wonderful example to choose, because I think the deepest meaning of us starting this adventure into radical regeneration by writing about joy is that both of us, in different but very complementary ways, discovered joy in the middle of our own dark nights and in the middle of waking up to the massive, massive chaos and pain and sorrow and devastation of the global dark night.
Well, I think
And the
that's,
reason why I say that is because that's the whole secret point of the book, Radical Regeneration, is that if you're going to see this time only as a time of horror and grief, you're going to miss the tremendous opportunity that a time of horror and grief offers you of discovering deeper levels of joy than you ever imagined, which, when you discover them, enable you to be creative within the horror and grief, and to stay energized and stay loving and stay serving and stay cherishing and honoring and celebrating life.
yeah.
And you were saying that you
Well,
discovered.
as you were talking, I was thinking about Viktor Frankl and his discovery of meaning and purpose, and what a sense of meaning and purpose did for all of the inmates around him. How he observed that if they could find even the smallest meaning in what they did every day, it helped them survive. And then, of course, there are these stories of inmates sitting around, behind the backs of the Nazis and telling jokes. And there was in Auschwitz, even in the death camps, there is even there a sense of humor, on certain occasions. But it was that profound discovery of meaning and purpose that gave him joy. And he was able to tap into that deep well of joy that we all have within us. And it is so true, like you said, that we discover these things in the midst of sorrow and sometimes in the midst of horror.
No, I asked you the question and I asked myself the question, and I discovered joy at its deepest in the worst period of my life when I was going through terrifying inner dark night. My husband and I were living in San Francisco. I had left my guru, who was homophobic. I'd been declared the Antichrist. Our lives were threatened daily. We had bombs thrown through our windows. We very often felt that we may not survive the day. It was that extreme and that painful and that horrifying. And also, we were being attacked by black magic at the same time. So it was a comprehensive, dreadful experience. But when I remember that time, of course, I remember the horror, but I also, and far more importantly, remember how that time made me discover the ecstasy of human love, because our love during that time became the one source of truth that we could rely on in the mother. And so when things got really terrible, as they did every day, we would put on Tina Turner, I Don't Want to Fight No More, and we would dance naked in our living room. And that dancing to celebrate our love and the power of love in the world gave us the guts to go through what we had to go through. And I thought of a second moment which was revelatory for me. And that was when I was writing The Hope. At the end of writing The Hope, I was still very perturbed as to how to organize sacred activism in a way that could really make sense for people on the ground. And I was staying at a convent. I had just given a series of talks on Jesus to these wild nuns who loved it. If you ever want to really go for Jesus, go to the nuns. They know Jesus. And we were celebrating. My favorite nun was Sister Rosa, who was in her 90s and had been a true terrorist of love and was one of the great sacred activists I ever met. She'd been, whenever there was anything going on in Ohio that needed truth to be told to power, Sister Rosa would go in her wheelchair, hog the cameras, and just sock the truth to the people. So she was tremendously loved. And I went up to her and I said, look, I'm having this problem about how to organize it. And she said, oh, don't worry. She said, ask him. I said, who? She said, ask Jesus. Stop worrying about it. Go now and get into that chapel and pray. Just do it. And you didn't disobey Sister Rosa. So I went into the chapel and I was alone, and I really prayed as I've never prayed before. Please, please show me the way to help people get into the capacity to organize and come together. And that night I had a very central vision. And there were two scrolls that were unrolled in the sky in front of me. One said networks of grace, which came to be the way in which people could organize in networks of grace in their ordinary lives with others to really encourage and sustain each other. But the other scroll said joy is the power. Joy is the power. Mm-hmm. And oh my God, I got it. That if we are going to really get through this terrible period, and if we're going to be instruments of the birth of a new humanity, this radical regeneration we're talking about in this book, we have to align ourselves, heart, mind, soul, and body with that overwhelming bliss force that is, as all mystics know, the core of the nature of God, the core of the nature of the universe, because it's only through aligning yourself with that force in an age of horror, chaos, madness, and devastation that you'll be able to stay vivid and vibrant and juicy and alive and passionate and serving. That was a huge revelation for me, and that has actually informed everything that I've done and everything that we have done in this book, I thought that what we do now, if it was okay with you, is just concentrate on that chapter that's really the core chapter of our book on Return of Joy, which is called Myriad Flames of Joy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I thought that I would begin just by reading the quote from Rumi that we put at the head of it.
Of course.
If you are seeking, seek us with joy, for we live in the kingdom of joy. Do not give your heart to anything else, but to the love of those who are clear joy. Do not stray into the neighborhood of despair, for they are real. They exist. Do not go in the direction of darkness. I tell you, suns exist. And when Rumi's saying that there are hope, they exist, he's not necessarily saying that climate change isn't threatening us with extinction or authoritarianism isn't rising to try and extinguish the very core of the human spirit. He's not saying that.
Right.
He's saying that in our inmost nature, in our divine consciousness, in the experience of that, there is an experience of radical hope because that experience gives a knowledge of our deathlessness and of our being held and supported and nourished and energized, whatever happens.
Right.
So with that, I'd just like to read the first paragraph of the, and then concentrate on four of the flames, our favorite four.
Yeah.
Joy, we have discovered, is a subversive force. And in our current crisis, the most transforming expression of this force is sacred activism. The truest and deepest joy comes not only from recognizing one's essential nature as joy, but in expressing that joy in wise, focused, radical action that implements justice, harmony, balance, and compassion. The joy of which we are speaking is not a narcissistic private joy. It is a joy that reflects the essential nature of reality and also the deepest meaning of human life, as revealed by all the great prophets and mystics of humanity, a meaning that can only be discovered in its fullness in radical, selfless service and the commitment to a life dedicated to living joy in sacred relationship with all beings. So with that as a frame, I thought that we would plunge into the first joy that we really plunge into, which is the joy of loving the sacred.
Mm. Mm.
And I'd like to quote from Llewellyn Vaughan Lee. The mystical path takes us into the center of the heart, where the mystery of love takes place. Initially, this love is often experienced as longing, a deep desire for God, the beloved divine truth, or simply an unexplained ache in the heart. Mystics are lovers who are drawn toward a love in which there is no you or me, but only the moment of love itself. And they are prepared to pay the ultimate price to realize this truth, the price of themselves. In the words of the great 13th century Christian mystic Hadovich of Antwerp, those who were two at first are made one by the pain of love. Gradually, we discover that this love and longing slowly and often painfully destroys all our outer and inner attachments. And then we come into the joy of the divine presence. So what does loving the sacred mean for you right now? Not in terms of the book, but
Mhm.
right now in the middle of beginning this crazy period that we're just beginning,
Yeah.
the period of the indictment. What does it mean to you?
For me, loving the sacred is very much about nature. It's very much
Mm,
about being in touch with um, creation and the living beings that are all around me. My dog, of course, but the mountains that I see every day, the beautiful trees that, even though they don't have their leaves on right now, stand there, waiting to expand themselves
yes.
and burst forth their greenery for spring and summer. Um, but also the fact that everyone is conscious. Now, I'm not talking about conscious, awake, awoke. I'm not talking about that. But
Yeah.
everyone is conscious. We're conscious beings, we're aware. Um, and that consciousness does not come from matter, it just is. And it bursts forth, and in fact, everything comes from it. Um, Matter comes from consciousness. Conscious doesn't come from matter. And that awareness is in all of us and every living thing. And that awareness allows people to be courageous. It allows people to discern what is right and wrong. And it allows people to come forth and say, I want to take a stand. I am compelled to take a stand for what is honorable. And so, in the context of this week, I mean, I could have gone anywhere with this question, but in the context of this week, where we see this line drawn in the sand by some courageous people, namely Alvin Bragg,
Yes.
who, courageous people make sacrifices. And he's going to have to watch his back the rest of his life. His family may get harmed or doxxed or God knows what. It's a sacrifice that he's choosing to make because he is aware and he wants to do the right thing. And we can think whatever we want about how he's doing it or when he's doing it, but he's aware, he's
Yes.
conscious.
Oh
And
God.
yeah, and so he's not the only one, thank
And
God.
there's tremendous joy in witnessing somebody that noble and prepared,
Yes, and
because he's the best of ourselves, mirrored back
absolutely,
at us. Yes.
absolutely. And so I don't like to use the word hopeful, but I am anticipating that he will not be the last one. I think there is a weariness in our culture right now
Oh my God, yes.
about, oh, when are we going to see accountability? When are we going to see justice served? And I recall last week, the day before the indictment, Bragg had just said, I'm going to slow the investigation down a little bit, which is a great bait and switch because, in fact, he sped it up the next day. But I
Cheeky.
could feel in my body when he said that, this weariness of, oh my God, when are we going to break through and start seeing some accountability? There's a weariness in our culture with this madness, with this injustice that has been rampant for the past 8 years, really. And so when he took that stand, and said, this is what we're going to do, my whole body just kind of relaxed. And, I I say this with, with great care. It's going to take a long time for justice to really be served around these issues, but it's a beginning.
Yes.
And the beginning brings me great joy.
I love that. And it's sacred, isn't it? It's a
Absolutely
sacred
is.
stance that he's taking
Yeah, yeah,
on behalf of all of us, on behalf of the rule of law, without which there can be no democracy.
right.
The second flame of this great joy that permeates everything that we want to celebrate is the flame of joy that celebrates the earth, the creation.
Mm.
And I'd just like to try and describe what it was like for me first to go to Ladakh when it was just open. I was 30 and I was one of the first band of Europeans to actually get into Ladakh. And I will never forget being on one of those terrifying buses that used in those days to take 2 days
Oh,
to go
yeah,
from Srinagar to
yeah,
Leh. Now you can
yeah,
go in an hour on a plane.
yeah.
And as I entered into this stark, luminous Himalayan kingdom, I saw on the one hand these vast rocks and then these green valleys with little houses that had drying golden apricots on their roofs, stunningly gold. And I will never forget the overwhelming, glorious impact of that mountain miracle with the rivers and the green and the apricots drying gold. It was like a vision of heaven on earth. Those of you who've read Journey in the Dark know what happened, which is that I really met a living Buddha and became very, very drawn and initiated into Mahayana Buddhism. That was not where I was going, because what happened was that I went back 4 times in the next 3 years for like 2 or 3 months at a time. And most of that time I spent walking in the mountains,
Mm.
just breathing in the glory, the glory, the glory, purity, the splendor. And it was through that walking, which took me all over Ladakh. So I was walking Ladakh into the core of my being. Through that experience, I understood beyond concepts, beyond reason, how Ladakh had become such an extraordinary crucible for mystical revelation, because the capacity of that landscape to inspire the deepest sacred truth, because it was the living emblem of that sacred truth, became real to me. So that was how I was baptized into the glory of the earth. But I know that for you, the earth, because of your great love for the African indigenous tradition, and because of your own nature, your own love of nature, has been an endless source of joy and energy.
I notice that I would say 20 years ago, well, I've always loved nature and I've gone camping and I've loved to hike and be in the back country. But I've noticed that in the last 20 years, my relationship with nature has deepened like
Mm,
I can't believe. And so, let's say 20 years ago, I used to walk in nature and really appreciate nature. And I would observe and I'd be aware. But today I walk in nature and it's like a luminous experience now. It's like I feel in my body the presence of these other beings, the
yes.
trees, the sounds of the birds, um, the smell of the pine, here in Colorado, the breeze on my face. I mean, these are like living beings, and I feel a deep love and a deep kinship with them. And I suppose a lot of it has to do with aging, but it also has to do with allowing and participating in the inner work that I've done that has needed to be done, that allows me then to appreciate creation, to appreciate the natural world as my brother, as my sister, as my family, and to feel it in my body.
It's really the transformation we're calling for in the whole book, isn't it?
It is.
The transformation from being the dissociated observer,
Right.
appreciating mildly, to being the participatory lover
Absolutely.
in the great love affair
Yeah.
that is the love affair between the transcendent and the immanent. That is the sacred marriage out of which everything is being born at every moment. And those sound very grand words, but they're not, it's not a grand experience. It's a gorgeous experience, but it's a normal, ordinary experience once you've allowed yourself to be established in it.
Right.
And you find that nature is constantly saying the most amazing yes.
Yeah.
Yes to its own flowering, even when it involves death and sadness and grief and loss. Those are not the final words of nature. Winter isn't the final word of nature.
No.
Spring
No.
comes after
Yeah.
winter. And that gives you a great clue, too, to what's going on in the winter of our global dark night, that it is, for all of its horror and chaos, preparing the spring we cannot yet imagine, but which we can work for once we connect with this fundamental reality
Right.
of the creation.
Right. Absolutely.
Wow. Oh, this is exciting. Let's go to the third flame that we chose, and that's the flame of sacred relationship. I think one of the great gifts of COVID to me, and I suspect it was to you too, because we did a lot of our work through
Yes.
COVID epidemic, and a
Yes,
lot
we
of
did.
radical generations about the lessons that.
Yeah.
But one of the really intense lessons that I think we both learned and learned in our own relationship is the absolute necessity in a time like this of cherishing our heart, friends, and of feeding the relationship, honoring the relationship, listening at a deeper level than we've ever listened to the truths of the other.
Right.
And our book really was the child of this sacred relationship, the sacred fusion of our being
Yes.
at every level, heart, mind, soul, and body.
Right.
Not sexually, but
Mhm.
as great friends who love and revere each other.
Mm.
And the fusion in joy, from that joyful fusion of our different but totally complementary ways of seeing and understanding this crisis, which could come together in that joy. So we lived out in our own relationship that sacred explosion of joy through sacred relationship.
We absolutely did. And so many people that I'm close with tell me the same thing about just their relationships in general with people. And being in a time of tremendous darkness and death everywhere, and not knowing if am I going to be the next person to get COVID? And of course, my dad passing away of COVID in 2020. And there was a new spirit of caring among many, many people that I had not seen before in my lifetime, and that I don't think could have been manifest without the horrible pandemic.
Absolutely.
And
And that's a lesson for this whole period, isn't it?
yes,
I'm
it is.
just a couple of nights ago, I was watching a documentary on Ukraine, and it was set with a group of young soldiers on the front lines, and they were going through how they'd lost three of their buddies. Shells were whirling above them, but one of them said, and it was so beautiful, he said, I don't live anymore for victory. I don't live anymore for tomorrow. I live for him. He pointed to his friend,
Uh-huh.
and they both cried and they held each other
Oh, wow.
because they discovered in the middle of all of this madness that they were going through the absolute supremacy of human friendship, of how precious and how amazing it is when you really see it naked,
Yeah.
which is what those boys were doing because they had nothing else but each other. But it was not just enough. It was a kind of revelation, clearly, and they would never, ever, ever forget it. You knew that those guys, if they survived,
Right.
they'd be brothers in the
Absolutely.
flesh for the rest of their lives and do everything to support and encourage each other. We should be living like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It reminds
Yeah.
me of a story I just saw a couple hours ago about a guy. I would say he's probably in his 50s, who he has a van, and he's an American. He's in Ukraine, and in the back of his van is an enormous water tank,
Wow.
and he goes around from village to village, um, and people bring their jugs. And he's got a big hose on the tank. I don't know where he gets this pure water, but the people come around and fill up their jugs a couple of times a week. And that's all he does. And that's sacred activism.
Oh, of
It's
course.
also incredible love because this is the only clean water some of these people have. And what an important service, what an important outpouring of love this man is manifesting.
Absolutely. That leads to our fourth flame that we want to talk about, and that is the flame of the joy of truth telling and justice making.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something we know quite a bit about because I think one of the things that I hope I've been able to get over to people in my teaching, and I don't know whether I have or not, is that however painful and terrible the truth that you are compelled by your divine mission or the divine in you to tell, there is an enormous joy in telling it because you align yourself with truth, and in telling it, you create an opportunity for the birth of a rugged truth. And it's not something that you can know unless you've actually constantly done it. Some of my most exhilarating moments of relationship with God have come after I've given some of the most devastating talks I've felt compelled to give because I've experienced that paradox of the truth will set you free.
Yeah.
The freedom which I was able to find to be able to tell the truth without mask and illusion was an initiation itself into a joy beyond disaster. And I know you know that. And I'd just like to read the paragraph that we wrote. If people knew how much time we spent on all of these paragraphs trying to get it as clear as possible, we would
Exactly.
get the Nobel Prize.
Absolutely.
Although we have devoted an entire chapter to the joy of service and sacred activism, there is yet another joy that makes it possible to engage in these and also liberates us from the reality of the collective shadow that engulfs our world. We are confronting the realities of catastrophe, climate change, the disappearance of species, the potential extinction of all life on Earth, the possibility of endless war, ghastly economic inequality, the horrific oppression of human trafficking and sexual exploitation, the worldwide epidemic of countless forms of addiction, the plight of millions of war and climate refugees around the world seeking safety and sanctuary, as deplorable as these realities are, they are what is so in the history of our species at this moment. To deny the horror, on the one hand, keeps us comfortable in the short term, but in the longer term, our denial has a debilitating consequence as it becomes an increasingly onerous burden in the unconscious mind and, by extension, the body. In our work in recent years, we've consistently offered support and inspiration to those individuals who are willing to cast off the burden of denial and befriend the dark emotions that invariably attend our willingness to see what is so. Although disorienting, unfamiliar, and daunting, the joy of truth-telling and justice-making, the joy of, in some sense, standing outside the culture of the planetary death machine, seeing it for what it is, and endeavoring to be love in action in an age of despair. This is the radical joy radiated in the beaming face of the Dalai Lama, the indefatigable cheerfulness of Desmond Tutu, and the tears of joy running down the face of Martin Luther King when he spoke of having been to the mountaintop. This is the joy, born of heartbreak, the joy that ripens into exquisite compassion. And this compassion, Eckhart Tolle reminds us, does not happen until sadness merges with joy, the joy of being beyond form, the joy of eternal life. How does that joy of truth-telling and justice-making sustain you? How do you experience it?
Well, in my personal life, in looking at my own family history, that's the beginning of the joy of truth-telling. Having to acknowledge some very painful truths about, wounding and dysfunction and trauma in the family. At the risk of being really ostracized by some people in the family. And the release and relief that come from speaking that truth, even though some people don't want to hear it. And then working as a therapist, and even today, as I continue to work with people in spiritual counseling and coaching, to witness what happens when people are able to grieve with spirit, and they are able to say what was so about their families, and particularly what was so about, their own sorrow as they were growing up, and the things that, their shadow, things they had to send away in order to be accepted, and reclaiming those and grieving. And invariably, without exception, I've never seen an exception, when people are able to do that, it opens up a little by little, and then to a very large extent, waterfalls of joy. The waterfalls of tears become waterfalls of joy and gratitude that bubbles up within, and freedom that was suppressed. The joy was suppressed by suppressing the grief. And
right. And this is one of
paradox.
That's so important what you're saying, because one of the things that we have been so resolute about, both in both of our work, is our real fury at denial. And people sometimes characterize this as a kind of cruelty in both of us. But in fact, the force behind that fury at denial is the knowledge that denial prevents you from discovering this tremendous sacred joy that comes when you do face things as they are, when you do tell the truth, when you do note and absolutely express everything that is real in you and in the situation.
Yeah.
Isn't that so?
That is so true. That is so absolutely true. And we're just not used to it in this culture. But I think collectively, as the truth continues to come out about this person who shall not be named, but we all know who he is, as the truth continues to come out there, I think there will be, or there could be, a mass catharsis and a sense of shoulders dropping and great relief that all of this is out in the open, particularly if he has to be accountable.
From your mouth to Godzilla's ears, as my granny used to say.
Right.
But it's our job, isn't it, to prepare that
Yes.
birth,
Yes.
to model it, and to live from joy is the best way to do that.
Absolutely.
So, my dear friends, we've given you just a taste of what you will discover in Return to Joy and what you'll discover in Radical Regeneration. You'll discover that there is a tremendous joy underlying all of our ferocious analyses, because we know at this time in our lives that, in the words of that great Yiddish parable, if there's so much manure, there has to be a donkey somewhere. Well, the donkey is radical regeneration.
Yeah.
And that's what we're celebrating with great joy, but not a joy that depends on any denial of any of the suffering, but
Exactly.
has been instructed through suffering and through grace that that suffering has meaning, which we can align with to birth a whole
We
new way
invite
of being.
you. We invite you to read Radical Regeneration and utilize the many tools and practices that are offered in there, which can only bring you joy.
DrewHarvey.net, and what's yours, darling?
CarolynBaker.net.
CarolynBaker.net. Come and join us on our adventure.
Absolutely. Thank you.